There is an image the staff still remember from the winter of 2012, and it is one you have almost certainly seen a version of yourself. Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, stepping out of a car for a public engagement, smiling, waving, steady on her feet, when barely an hour earlier, according to a household aide later cited by biographers, she had been violently ill behind a closed door and had asked to keep the true scale of it from her own husband until she had no choice. If these quieter royal histories are worth your time, subscribing costs nothing, and more of them are already queued. The bell is how they find you. Hold on that image for a moment, because everything about this story lives inside it. The woman on the step is composed, the woman behind the door was not, and the distance between those two women is the whole thing. Look at that wave again for a second, because you have seen 100 photographs like it, and never once read it correctly. The gloved hand lifts. The head tilts towards the crowd. The smile arrives exactly on cue. The smile everyone described as effortless. And it was not effortless at all. According to the household account, she had spent the earlier part of that day being sick, quietly, in private, and had made a decision that most people in her position would not have made. She would not tell William how bad it truly was. Not yet. Not until her body left her no other option. This is the secret she kept from her own husband. And here is the part that should unsettle you. The people paid to notice everything about her, the staff who managed her diary, who stood in the next room, who watched her more closely than her own family did, never once suspected. They saw the same wave you saw. They read it the same way you did. They filed it under a good day. So before we go any further, understand what kind of person is capable of that. Not a woman caught out by a bad morning, a woman who could carry something serious through a public appearance and hand no one, not the press, not the palace, not her husband, a single thread to pull. That is not luck. That is a skill. And skills like that are learned somewhere. To understand where she learned it, you have to go back before the title, before the wave, before any of it. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton was not born into this world. She came from Berkshire, from a family that had built its own money, a commoner in the oldest and bluntest sense of that word. When she married Prince William in April 2011, in front of Westminster Abbey, and something close to 2 billion people watching around the planet, the story the world was sold was simple and clean. Here was the steady one, the natural, the girl who had somehow walked into the most scrutinized family on earth and made it look easy. That was the image, effortless, unbreakable, the royal who never complained, never wobbled, never gave the cameras a bad frame. She was marketed, and there is no gentler word for it, as the antidote to every royal drama that had come before her. Where others had cracked in public, she would not. Where others had bled onto the front pages, she would stay sealed. And here is what friends have said since, quietly, to biographers. That image was partly her own construction. She did not simply happen to be composed. She built the composure. She engineered it deliberately. Over years, the way you would build a wall between the part of your life the public gets and the part it does not. The effortless royal was a piece of work. Careful work. Her work. Why would anyone go to that much trouble? Because she had watched what happened when the wall was not there. Before the wedding, before the title, there were the waiting years. William and Kate met at university, and then came a long, drawn-out courtship that the tabloids found endlessly useful, because for a stretch of it, there was no engagement, no ring, no announcement, just a young woman photographed, getting in and out of cars, going to work, going home, waiting. And the press gave her a name for it. They called her Waity Katie. waiting Katie, the girl hanging around for a prince to make up his mind. It was mocking, and it was relentless, and it followed her for years. Every ordinary outing became evidence. Every appearance was measured against whether he had proposed yet. She could not go and buy a coffee without it being read as a woman in a holding pattern, biding her time, hoping. Ask yourself what years of being mocked in print teaches a person about what is safe to show and what is safer to hide. Because that is the real education here. Not a finishing school, not a palace tutor, a decade of learning in the hardest possible way, that anything you reveal can and will be turned into a headline you did not write. And she drew a conclusion from it. Friends described the same instinct again and again. If the press could take your visible life and twist it, then the only genuinely safe thing you owned was the part they could not see. Silence was not weakness. Silence was the one territory she controlled. She learned to absorb things, disappointment, pressure, pain, without letting any of it reach her face. She learned that the composed version of a moment was safer than the honest one, because the composed version could not be used against her. That is the lesson she carried into the marriage. That is the woman standing on the step in the winter of 2012. So now put the two things side by side. On one side, a young woman who has spent years training herself to give nothing away, who has decided that control over her own story is the most precious thing she has. On the other, the single most punishing test that instinct could possibly face. And that test had a medical name, hyperemesis gravidarum. If you have never heard the term, you are not meant to have. It is not morning sickness. Morning sickness is a queasy hour and a dry cracker. This is a different order of thing entirely, a severe unrelenting sickness in pregnancy that can leave a woman unable to keep down food or even water, sometimes for weeks, sometimes to the point of hospital and a drip in the arm. It is exhausting in a way that is hard to describe to anyone who has not lived near it. It does not politely confine itself to the mornings. It does not wait for a convenient hour. And it arrived early in her first pregnancy, the first child, the heir everyone was waiting for, the most watched pregnancy in the world, and it came wrapped in an illness that would have flattened almost anyone. Now, what does a normal person do when they are that ill? They tell someone. They lean on the person closest to them. They let the mask drop, because being that sick is not something you can reasonably be expected to perform your way through. Her instinct was the opposite. Her instinct was concealment. Read that again, because it is genuinely strange. Faced with an illness serious enough to put her in a hospital bed, her first move was not to reach out. It was to hide, to manage it herself, to keep the true scale of it off her own husband's radar for as long as she possibly could. The wall she had spent a decade building did not come down when things got hard. When things got hard is exactly when she reinforced it, and she was good at it. That is the uncomfortable heart of this. She was so good at it that the sickness became for a time another thing to be timed and hidden and worked around, like a difficult date in the diary. The public saw a duchess going about her duties. The staff saw a duchess going about her duties. Nobody saw the woman behind the closed door because she had made absolutely certain nobody would. Which leaves two questions hanging in the air, and I want you to sit with both of them, because the answers are where this stops being a story about morning sickness and becomes something much stranger. The first question is the obvious one, and it is the one that does not make immediate sense. Why him? You could understand hiding it from the press, of course you could. She had every reason in the world to keep the tabloids out of her body. You could even understand hiding it from the wider household, the staff, the machinery of the palace. But William was her husband. William was the one person on earth who was meant to share this. This was his child too. So why, of all the people she shut out, was he on the list? What could possibly justify keeping the truth from the very person the truth belonged to most? The second question is about time, and it is almost harder to believe than the first. How long? How long can a woman actually hide an illness this severe? An illness that steals your strength and empties your stomach and leaves you unable to stand some mornings, while still walking out to the cameras looking steady, still smiling, still lifting that gloved hand. A day, maybe, you might manage on sheer will. But this went on. It held. And the fact that it held for as long as it did tells you something about her that no official biography ever quite says out loud. Both answers exist. Both are documented, attributed, on the record from people who were near enough to know. And both of them turn that pleasant, familiar photograph into something you will not be able to look at the same way again. Because here is what the household account actually says about why she did it, and it is not what you would guess. The reason she chose silence over confession has a name, and it has a location. William was not at home. He was not down the corridor. In that period, he was serving as an RAF search and rescue pilot, based hundreds of miles from London, the man they scrambled into a helicopter in the worst weather to pull people off cliffs and out of the sea. It was demanding, dangerous work, and it required a clear head and full attention, because the price of a distracted pilot is not a bad meeting. It is a life. And Catherine had made a decision about that. She had decided that she would not be the thing that frightened him while he was up there. She would not have him flying rescue missions with his mind back in London, worrying about a wife he could not reach and could not help. So she took the illness, the real severity of it, and she folded it away, and she carried it alone. Not because she had no one to tell, because the one person she wanted to tell was exactly the person she had decided to protect from it. That decision held for weeks. Weeks of walking out to the cameras looking well and coming home to a body that could keep nothing down. Weeks of managing the timing so precisely that no one around her joined the dots. And it held right up until the morning her body stopped giving her the choice, the morning it forced the whole thing out into the open, whether she was ready or not. What happened in those weeks, and what finally broke the silence, is where this story truly begins. But before that morning came, there were weeks. Weeks of a routine only she understood. A former member of the household later told a biographer what it actually looked like from the inside. Catherine was not simply enduring a bad patch of pregnancy. She was managing it, hour by hour, like a woman running a private timetable no one else could see. The sickness came in waves. She learned the shape of those waves, and she began scheduling her life into the narrow gaps between them. An engagement at 11 in the morning meant she had to be upright and smiling at 11, so she worked backwards. She knew roughly when the worst of it would hit, and she arranged the calendar around those hours, the way you might plan a journey around a tide. The public saw a duchess arriving on time, composed, unhurried. What the public did not see was the arithmetic behind it. Picture the discipline that takes. To schedule your public smile around when your body will let you stand. Not once, not for a single event, but for weeks, while everyone around you assumes you are simply well. Because that is what the household believed. The people paid to notice everything, the ones who read her moods before she spoke, the ones who knew which mornings were heavy and which were light. They did not put it together. She was that good at it. She would come home from an appearance, close the door, and give in to a body that could keep nothing down. Then she would recover, check the diary, and do it again. This was not ordinary morning sickness. The illness had a name, hyperemesis gravidarum, and it sits in a different category altogether. Ordinary morning sickness is nausea. This is relentless vomiting, sometimes dozens of times a day, the kind that empties you out until your body cannot hold water, let alone food. It leaves women hospitalized, on drips, unable to function. It is not something you push through with a biscuit and a lie down. And Catherine was hiding it in plain sight, walking out to cameras between the bouts. That is the gap at the centre of all of this. The woman on the step, hand raised, steady, radiant. And the woman behind the door an hour later, wrung out, gripping the edge of a basin. Same person, same day, two realities, and only one of them ever reached the public. She had built a wall between the two, and for weeks that wall held. And then it didn't. In December of 2012, the management stopped working. The illness won. She was too weak, too dehydrated, too ill to keep pretending it was nothing, and she was admitted to King Edward VII Hospital in London. That is the line the strategy could not cross. You can time an engagement around a wave of sickness. You cannot time a hospital admission. The moment she walked through those doors, the secret was no longer hers to keep. Here is the part worth slowing down on, because it changes how you remember the whole event. The announcement of that first pregnancy, the one the public greeted with delight, the one the papers ran under warm headlines, was never meant to happen when it did. William and Catherine had not chosen that moment. They had not planned a joyful reveal for early December. The pregnancy was still weeks away from the point at which couples traditionally go public, past the fragile early stretch, into safer ground. The hospital forced their hand. A duchess admitted to King Edward VII cannot be admitted anonymously. There would be photographers outside. There would be questions. The only way to explain her presence there was to explain why she was there. And so the confirmation the world remembers as happy news was, in truth, a containment failure. Her secret got out because her body gave out. The palace announced the pregnancy not because the moment was right, but because there was no longer any way to hold the line. Think about what that means for the image. The public version is a couple sharing wonderful news slightly early. The private version is a woman watching the one thing she had guarded for weeks slip out of her hands in a hospital bed. She had controlled the story right up until the point her health made control impossible. And even then, what leaked was only the fact of the pregnancy. The scale of what she had endured to keep it quiet stayed hidden longer, told later, and only by the staff who pieced it together in hindsight. Which brings us back to the question that has been sitting under all of this. Why keep it from William at all? Not from the press. That part you can understand instantly. But from her husband, from the one person on earth whose entire role, in theory, was to carry this with her. The man who would have wanted to know. The man who, by any ordinary measure, had a right to know. The answer, according to those close to the situation, has two parts, and they fit together. The first is simply where he was. William was not in London. He was serving as an RAF search and rescue pilot based far from the city, flying missions off the coast, plucking people out of dark water in a Sea King helicopter. That is not a desk job you leave early. It is dangerous, demanding work that requires total focus, because the lives of strangers depend on the man in that flight suit keeping his head. Catherine understood exactly what he was doing and what it required of him, and she made a calculation. If she told him how ill she truly was, he would be frightened. A frightened man does not fly search and rescue missions well. She would not put that weight on him while he was hundreds of miles away, unable to do anything but worry. So she carried it alone, not because she couldn't reach him, because she chose not to alarm him. She decided his focus, and by extension the safety of the people he was pulling from the sea, mattered more than her own comfort of being able to lean on him. That is the practical reason. But underneath it is the second reason, and the second reason is older and deeper, and it explains not just this decision, but every decision like it that would follow. Catherine trusted her own management more than she trusted shared alarm. She had reached a conclusion about herself long before this pregnancy, and the conclusion was this: the safest thing she owned was control over her own story. Tell someone, and the story becomes theirs too. It spreads. It gets discussed, worried over, acted upon by people who mean well, but who take a piece of it away from you. Keep it, and it stays yours, contained, manageable, hers. And where did a young woman from Berkshire learn to think that way about a private illness? Her friends have offered the answer, and it is the most sympathetic reading of everything she did. Catherine had watched what public exposure did to Diana. Diana, the mother-in-law she never met. Diana, who died before Catherine ever set foot in the family, but whose story Catherine knew as intimately as anyone alive, because she was marrying the son who had lived it. She had seen the photographs. She had seen the years of relentless coverage, the cameras that never blinked, the private pain turned into public spectacle, the sense of a woman consumed by the very attention the institution could not shield her from. If you remember what the press did to Diana, you already understand the decision Catherine was making. She had studied that outcome the way you study a warning, and she drew a lesson from it that shaped her entire approach to palace life. The more they know, the less you own. Every private thing that becomes public is a private thing that no longer belongs to you. So when the sickness came, her instinct was not to reach out. It was to close in, to hold the illness the way she held everything difficult, tightly, quietly, until she had no choice but to let go. It was the same instinct that had carried her through the years the tabloids called her Weighty Katie, when the press mocked her for waiting on William, for having no title, no job they respected, no purpose beyond a boyfriend who would not propose. She had absorbed those years in silence rather than hand the papers a reaction. Silence, she had learned, was the one thing they could not take from her and twist. Silence was armor. And that is the thing to understand about this whole episode. What looks, from the outside, like a strange or even hurtful decision, hiding a serious illness from your own husband, was not coldness, and it was not deception. It was a philosophy. It was a woman who had decided, based on everything she had watched happen to the woman before her, that the one part of royal life she could truly command was what she chose to say and what she chose to keep, even at the cost of leaning on William, even at the cost of carrying it alone. Now here is why this first secret matters so much, and why it is worth all this attention. Because it would be easy to file it away as a single episode, a difficult pregnancy, a private woman, a one-off choice made under specific pressure, understandable, contained, over. Except it wasn't a one-off. That is the whole point. What happened in the winter of 2012 was not a reaction. It was a rehearsal. The timed engagements, the wall between the woman on the step and the woman behind the door, the decision to shield the people she loved from fear by simply not telling them, the belief that control over her own story was the safest thing she owned. All of it was becoming her method, a way of moving through a life lived under constant observation, a default she would return to, because silence, once it works, is hard to give up, and for Catherine, it had worked. She had protected William's focus. She had kept the worst of the illness out of the papers. She had held her secret right up to the edge of what her body would allow. From where she stood, the strategy had not failed her. It had served her. The only cost was the loneliness of carrying it, and she had decided that cost was acceptable. So the question is no longer why she did it. We know why. The question is what a strategy like that does to a person over time, and whether the day would come when silence protected her less than it cost her. Whether the instinct that served her through one hidden pregnancy might, under different circumstances, ask far more of her than she could give. She had learned to keep the hardest things to herself. What happens when the hardest thing is bigger than a pregnancy she could hide for a few weeks? Because that day was coming. Not soon. Not for a long time. She would go on to have 3 children. She would grow into the role. She would become, in the public eye, the steady centre of the family, the future queen, the woman who seemed to carry everything without strain. The image would harden into something the whole country believed. And then, 12 years after that December in the hospital, the same instinct would surface again. Only this time the stakes would not be an illness she could time around, an illness she could hide for a matter of weeks before the announcement caught up with her. This time it would be something she could not schedule, could not manage into the gaps of a diary, could not simply walk out and smile through. In early 2024, Catherine did the thing she had always done when something serious arrived. She went quiet. She stepped out of view entirely, and the world, for once, noticed the silence before it, understood the reason. Weeks passed with no explanation, the internet, unable to bear an empty space, filled it with theories, each one wilder than the last. But behind the noise, staff say, the truth was already sealed inside her. She'd been told something serious, and she had made, once again, the exact choice she had made behind that door in 12 years earlier, to shield the family first, to hold the story until she was ready, to speak only when she chose to speak, and not a moment before. The same woman, the same instinct, a far heavier weight. The first sign was an absence. On the 16th of January in 2024, Kensington Palace put out a short statement. The Princess of Wales had undergone planned abdominal surgery. She was in hospital at the London Clinic in central London, and she would not be back to public duties until after Easter. That was it. No detail about what the surgery was, no diagnosis, no reason. Just a door closed politely in the world's face. And the world, being the world, refused to accept a closed door. For nearly 2 months there was nothing. No photographs, no engagements, no glimpse of her stepping out of a car and lifting her hand. Into that empty space poured every kind of nonsense. People studied the palace's few released images, frame by frame, hunting for signs of tampering. One family photo, put out on Mother's Day, was pulled by picture agencies because it had been edited, and that single misstep set the whole thing on fire. Where was she? Was the marriage over? Was she even alive? The theories got darker and stupider by the day, and they trended in country after country. Everyone had a theory that spring. Almost no one guessed the truth was something she had chosen not to say yet, because that is the part the noise drowned out. While strangers online played detective with a cropped photograph, Catherine was sitting inside a piece of news that none of them had the faintest access to. The surgery in January had been described as successful, but tests done afterwards had found something the palace did not announce at the time: cancer. And she knew. She had known privately for weeks, while the internet argued about whether she existed. Think about what that actually means. Every wild rumour, every cruel joke, every demand that the palace prove she was fine, all of it landing on a woman who was quietly beginning treatment for a disease that could kill her. She could have ended the speculation with one sentence at any moment. She chose not to. She chose, exactly as she had in 2012, to keep the true weight of it inside until she was ready to carry it out into the light on her own terms. On the 22nd of March, 2024, she did. There was no palace spokesman this time, no carefully worded press release read out by someone else. Catherine recorded her own video message. She sat outdoors, on a bench, in a striped jumper, spring flowers around her, and she spoke straight to the camera. Calm, steady. The same composure the staff had described a decade earlier, now aimed at millions of strangers at the worst moment of her life. She explained it plainly. The January surgery had been for a condition thought to be non-cancerous. Tests afterwards had found cancer present. She had begun what she called a course of preventative chemotherapy. She did not name the type. She did not owe anyone that, and she did not give it. What she gave instead was the reason for the silence. It had taken time, she said, to recover from major surgery and to begin treatment. But above all, it had taken time to explain everything to her 3 children in a way they could understand, and to reassure them that she was going to be okay. That was the delay. That was the thing worth more to her than putting out the internet fire. George, Charlotte, and Louis, at home, being told by their mother in words a child can hold. Everything else could wait. Everything else did wait. And here is the detail that reframes the whole story. Aides later confirmed that she had known the diagnosis privately for weeks before that video. During those weeks, she was managing not just her own children and her own fear, but the flow of information itself. For a time, even close staff were told only what they needed to know. The circle of people who understood the full truth was kept deliberately small. The woman who had once timed her public engagements around the hours she was least likely to be sick was now, 20 years on, timing the release of the gravest news of her life around the readiness of her family. Same instinct, same order of operations. Protect first, speak second, and speak only when the words are hers. Look at how precisely the 2 moments rhyme. In 2012, she hid the severity of an illness so that William, on a rescue helicopter far from London, would not be frightened by something he could not reach. In 2024, she held a cancer diagnosis quiet so that 3 children could be told gently and so that a family could steady itself before the story became public property. In both cases, the concealment came first. In both cases, the disclosure, when it finally came on her schedule and in her voice, not forced out of her, chosen. And here is where you have to stop and look at what you are actually seeing, because it stops being a story about 2 illnesses and becomes a story about 1 person. What looks like secrecy is, on the evidence, not a habit of hiding. It is a strategy learned young, under pressure, and never once abandoned. Go back to the girl the tabloids called Waity Katie, waiting years for a proposal while cartoonists drew her holding an imaginary ring. She learned then, watching herself be turned into a punchline, that almost nothing in that world would ever be hers to control. Not the headlines, not the nicknames, not the timing of the questions or the shape of the answers. She learned that the one thing she could truly command, the single lever the palace and the press could not take out of her hand, was silence. When to speak, what to withhold, whom to protect, and for how long. Everything the staff described flows from that. The composed woman on the car step who had been violently ill an hour before. The pregnancy revealed only because a hospital admission forced it. The cancer carried privately for weeks. These are not the acts of someone being deceptive. They are the acts of someone holding on to the only territory she was ever allowed to own. And there is a shadow standing behind all of it. Catherine never met Diana. She married into the space Diana had left. She had watched, as everyone her age had watched, what total exposure did to that woman, how every private wound became public spectacle, how the openness that made Diana beloved also left her with nowhere to hide, and no story that was still her own. Friends have said that Catherine drew a very deliberate lesson from that. The safest thing she could possess was command over her own narrative, even when it cost her, even when it meant leaning on her husband less than she might have, even when the price of staying private was staying alone inside the worst of it a little longer than she had to. That is the correction this whole story asks you to make. For years the public read Catherine one way, the effortless one, the unbreakable one, the Duchess who never complained, who always turned up, who always looked composed, and who therefore, the assumption went, simply had it easier. The gap between the smiling woman on the step and the one being sick behind the door was treated, when it was noticed at all, as a kind of pleasant mystery. Wasn't she marvellous? How does she do it? But that gap was never a trick, and it was never deception. It was the cost, it was the visible surface of an enormous private effort. The steadiness you admired was not the absence of suffering. It was suffering, managed in silence, so completely that you never saw the seams. What you called effortless was the single most effortful thing about her. If these quieter royal histories are worth your time, subscribing costs nothing, and more of them are already lined up. The bell notification is simply how they find their way to you. Then we can go back one last time to where this began. Because there is an image we started with, and it deserves to be looked at again now, that you know what stands behind it. The winter of 2012. A car door opens. Catherine steps out onto the pavement for a public engagement. She is smiling. She lifts her hand and waves to the crowd, steady on her feet, entirely in control. The staff who were there remember it as the picture of a woman perfectly at ease. What almost none of them knew was that an hour earlier she had been violently ill, that she had begged to keep the true scale of it from her own husband, and that the composure on that step was not calm at all. It was construction. It was a performance of wellness laid over a body in genuine distress, held up by nothing but will. Now go back to that 2012 photograph one last time and see if you can still call it effortless. Watch the hand. That small, ordinary, practiced wave. For years it read as nothing. The automatic gesture of a royal who was born to none of this and yet seemed made for all of it. But you know now what it can conceal. You know that the same hand, the same steadiness, the same open smile would one day be lifted through a first pregnancy she was too sick to keep hidden, and lifted again in spirit through a cancer she carried quietly for the sake of 3 children. The wave was never the easy part. The wave was the whole discipline of her life, compressed into one gesture. Show them the calm. Keep the rest. This is the secret she kept from William, and the reason even the staff who watched her most closely never once suspected. It was never a single hidden fact waiting to be exposed. It was a method, a way of standing upright in a world that had taught her, from the days it laughed at her and called her weighty Katie, that the only thing she would ever fully own was what she chose not to say. She kept the severity from her husband in 2012, not because she trusted him less, but because protecting the people she loved from her own fear was the one act of control the palace could never strip from her. She did it again in 2024, on a far graver scale, with the same quiet resolve. And by then, it was not a decision at all. It was simply who she was. And so the composed wave that opened all of this cannot be seen the same way again. It was never a woman to whom everything came easily. It was a woman doing, in plain sight, the hardest thing she knew how to do, and doing it so well that the world mistook the effort for grace, the smile, the lifted hand, the crowd waving back, none of them knowing. Hold that picture and ask yourself how much steadiness a single gesture can hide.